Welcome back to this online brown bag series on Follies in fragile states. My name is Ian Quick and this is part 4 of 6. We're turning to the next major folly of international engagement in the Congo, and that's geography denial. This is my favorite chapter in the book, and it's my favorite topic to present. To get a sense of why that is, let's take the most banal entry point imaginable, the Google image search or the Amazon search. You will quickly find that pretty much every trashy journalistic account of the country appends the unnecessary subtitle, A Journey in the Congo. Legitimate authors, too, like their geographic metaphors. V.S. Naipaul titled his post-colonial musings A Bend in the River. Aimé Césaire, his play on Patrice Lumumba, A Season in the Congo. Even very serious-minded histories and political science texts tend to have either a canoe on the Congo River or jungle canopy on the cover. Now, there's a good deal of simple racism here. Editors think a touch of the exotic will sell a few more copies, but there's also an unavoidable fact, which is that the physical terrain in the DRC hits you in the face. It is impossible to spend much time in the country and not have a love-hate relationship with traveling, simply because you spend so much time doing it. So let's lean into that. Up till now, I've been talking about abstractions, the Congo crisis, governance, state authority. Let's talk instead in a little bit of detail about the physical entity that we're referring to, and then walk through how that factored into planning. Some basics first. Topography at right. Darker shading indicates higher altitudes. What you're looking at then is the Albertine Rift, which divides the Somali Plate to the east from the rest of the African continent. That upthrust, that dark shading along the international border, is a very fertile, very hilly area that slopes down quite naturally into Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi to the east. The crossings across those borders are flat and easy, and there are very, very dense social and economic ties as a result that span the border between the Congo and its neighbors. If one goes west, on the other hand, the picture looks quite different. Roads trail off very quickly. The microclimate at altitude makes maintenance almost impossible. The overwhelming motif is mud and more mud. At left, then, we have population density. At the start of this arrow, it's about 170 people per square kilometer in the territories of Masisi and Rutshuru. That's a lot like Switzerland's. Halfway up the arrow in Walikale, that drops to 30 people per square kilometer. That's more like Brazil. At the tip of the arrow, then, it's about 15. Now, this is akin to Saudi Arabia or Algeria, massive desert countries. And from the tip of that arrow to Kinshasa, marked with the square, it's about 1,000 miles of equivalently empty space. On the ground, what does this mean? Well, the photographer Richard Moss went to meet this guy in Tiberi Cheka, the leader of a small but quite notorious militia. And Moss is best known for his photos with infrared film, as you can see. But the account reads like a travelogue. From the provincial capital, it's a full day's drive, several hours on a motorbike, then several hours literally hacking through the jungle with several guides. By the time he meets Cheka, it's nearly midnight, and the interview takes place in the early morning. To state the obvious, the National Army or other militias would have to do exactly the same process if they wanted to target Cheka, or vice versa if Cheka wanted to target them. Now, if we project this backwards in history, there are obvious consequences for how political institutions have evolved in Eastern DRC. There were plenty of strong institutions in this fertile, densely settled area, but they never spread very far. Not in the pre-colonial period, not in the colonial period under the Belgians, not under Mobutu. He himself struggled to establish effective authority in this area. Conversely, he survived a lot of rebellions solely by virtue of being physically isolated from them. During the Second Congo War in the 1990s, both Rwanda and Uganda established their spheres of influence in these areas, but they couldn't push far into the interior. So this war had not so much a battlefront as a vacuum in the middle of the country. Now the several billion-dollar question, how does all this intersect with what might work for political stabilization? Well, let's go back to the picture I already showed you. This is Bunyakiri in South Kivu, and it was used in marketing materials for international stabilization efforts. The reason I've used it here is because it perversely communicates almost the opposite. It's very easy to imagine yourself as part of a small police detachment perched on that hilltop, being asked to track down armed groups in that terrain, without much in the way of surveillance and certainly without airlift. By contrast, you can also imagine being part of an armed group, being asked to harass or attack this small isolated detachment a good half day away from any support. So this is the picture that you should have in your mind when we talk about ink spots or islands of stability in the DRC. With that in mind, let's zoom out one click on Google Maps. I told the story of the attack on the Kinyandoni police station in parts 2 and 3 of this series. That's the photo at top right. I want to add some context now on why it was so difficult to prevent this sort of thing, these repeated raids and harassment, as the text there notes. What you're looking at left is the immediate surrounds of Kinyandoni. Flat, good road leading up to the Ugandan border. Kinyandoni is the black square, the red diamonds are deployments of the UN peacekeeping mission. And what's striking is these are pretty much the most favorable conditions you'll find anywhere in eastern Congo. And yet, that box is about 5,000 square kilometers. Much of it, moreover, is taken up by Virunga National Park. That black arrow from Kinyandoni indicates the distance to the park, and it's just a few kilometers. Virunga was made famous a few years ago by a documentary about mountain gorillas, but there's a flip side to that. Look at that terrain. Once you're off the few roads in this area you're walking, steep hills, as you can see, extending far into the distance. Population density drops to nearly zero. The consequence is that Virunga has been a transport corridor and also a base of operations for armed groups for a long time. The FDLR is the largest and most dangerous of these, and imposing control, driving the FDLR and others out of this area, has proved almost impossible. The government swept the area you're looking at with massive military operations in 2008-9, the Umoja Wetu and Amani Leo operations, 50,000 plus troops, supported by the Rwandans, supported by the UN mission. But all the cliches of counter-guerrilla warfare applied. They could not do anything more than temporarily disperse the FDLR. The FDLR, on the other hand, could very easily concentrate enough force to conduct these harassment attacks on police or military outposts as and when they wanted to. With that operational context there, let's pull out a few more clicks on Google Maps and look at the problem at its true scale. We fondly call this the explosion map. It's the concept of operations for UN-led stabilization from 2008 to 12. And the green arrows here are the priority target areas for efforts to improve security and to extend the presence and legitimacy of the central government. What you should be thinking about already, I hope, is the distances. And the clue here is in the size of the country of Rwanda. Translating that, the box as a whole is a bit over 1 million kilometers squared. This is something like the entire countries of Mali, Ethiopia, or South Africa. And those straight lines, those clean green lines, mislead. There's an easy symbolism there that's appealing, but belies the realities on the ground. To illustrate this, let's take a trip down axis number 5 there, pushing into that hinterland that I described earlier. My colleagues drove this in 2011, after, I should add, several years of roadworks. And when they returned and gave their mission report, it had the feeling of an epic travelogue. They had managed 20 to 25 kilometers a day in this terrain. They counted 48 villages along 300 odd kilometers of road, many of which had not been visited by a car in a generation. The locals reported that they were occasionally attacked by the FDLR, but that these carters had walked several days out of the jungle from unknown locations. Finally, they reached Shabunda town and they met with local officials, who themselves flew in and out of post rather than taking the road. The territorial administrator, the senior civilian official, told them essentially all the territory is controlled by armed groups. The judge, and there was a judge, said simply that it was impossible to organize sessions outside of Shabunda's center. Both noted that the territory of Shabunda is about 25,000 square kilometers in that terrain you're looking at top left. Finally, they went and met the head of office for the UN Development Program in town. And he said, and I quote, that re-establishment of state authority was an essential step to improve quality of life throughout the territory. This promptly went onto the internet as part of the fundraising communications. The question, of course, is how on earth could we do that? What kinds of resources were needed? What kind of approach would work in this physical environment that you're looking at? Well, these are the questions we'll turn to in the next part of this series. So please click on through, and thank you for listening.